that verbal representation simultaneously, and that you teach one concept at a time, not five, one simple concept at a time, and then move in a sequential fashion, starting with the simplest concepts that build in a logical sequence to the more complex. One of the things that's really important for you to know, whether you've got a child that experiences this or not, you will in your lifetime run into someone and have the ability to guide them to the right kind of help that struggles with reading and or writing. One of the things that, kind of a simple way I can explain it is this, what's happening. And I know I've shared this before, but I'm just kind of going to do a quick overview to kind of make this connection of why this sequential and explicit instruction and intentional instruction is so important. You know, you may have had someone say you're more left-brained or you're more right-brained. You may have heard that at some point in your lifetime. And again, it's kind of a gross generalization, but there is some definite truth there. The two hemispheres do process information differently from each other. The left hemisphere deals with things from a part-to-whole perspective. And the way that it processes is based upon sequence. It goes in steps and builds and all of those things automatically. Now the right hemisphere processes things from a whole to part perspective and goes more of a spatial awareness. Spatial orientation is the way things are processed, where it's located in orientation to the space around it. So when you're thinking about language, our language in particular, the English language, the way that we process it is in a left to right sequential process to produce the sound and then to connect to what that word is in our working memory to be able to pull that out and use it appropriately. So it would make sense then that we would access that left hemisphere, the one that does work from a part to whole perspective and is based upon sequential processing. Well, for a large majority, 1 in 5, some say that's even a little bit higher, but at least that of individuals who don't function that way when they're dealing with language. They don't access that back left hemisphere that's the visual spatial end to way they process what the visual content is in front of them. They're okay verbally. That left frontal hemisphere seems to stay intact and even tends to get overused to compensate. So verbal vocabulary can be intact. But the ability to connect that to the visual representation, to read and to write, is different because they don't access that automatic language center. They access, to compensate, they access the right side, which again, remember, goes from a whole to part perspective. And it's based upon spatial orientation, which is one of the reasons my son could recognize the word one line, but have that same word appear just a few lines later and act like he'd never seen it before. His ability to recall that word and pull it out from memory was based upon spatial orientation, where that word was located on that page, maybe proximity to the picture, a number of concrete nouns around it. He was not accessing that word phonetically at all. And so when it was taken out of a certain situation, he wasn't able to recall it and be able to use that correctly. So when they're not accessing that side, it's not just a nice thing for us to do to teach this way, it's vital for their success because they don't do that. And the only way that we can help make those connections is by teaching in that very way that they need to have taught, that will access that automatic language center and start to fire those things to create automaticity in those. Those that struggle, part of the diagnosis now for those with language processing disorders, for those with ADD, for those with autism, is a executive function deficiency or weakness. That executive function, kind of the controls of our brain, affects things like impulse, attention, initiative, organization. But the main, like to simplify it into 4 things, it makes our children and our, those that we know struggle with the ability to filter, prioritize, categorize, and connect. And another subset of that executive function is a working memory deficiency. It can be related more of a phonetic end, the phonological working memory deficit, or, run the gamut that can, because there's, different areas of working memory. One of the things that is important to help in that, again, is the way that we present this information, not just that the content's there. We need to chunk information into bite-sized pieces to help with, being able to use it in working memory, one thing at a time. They can only hold one thing and manipulate it until some of those other processes are automatic. That's really key, and so I'm going to point out the ways that we do that as well. And frameworks, they need frameworks or organizational tools because they lack that ability to be able to plug in information that will be consistent and familiar, to be able to find the success that they need when working with these elements of reading and writing. So we are research-based, and that's important, that we are proven, that we are aligned with all of these things that have been shown to be necessary, that we're explicit, that we're systematically sequenced, and that we're multisensory. Too often we think we're being multisensory when we work with our children in the morning and talk about it and then draw a picture of it later in the afternoon. For it to be multisensory in a fashion that does what it needs to in the brain, those modalities need to be bundled very quick in time and back to back, so that they're using all the sensory input and motor output tied to language. When we're using when we're reading, we're using our eyes, that sensory input. When we're listening, the ears, the sensory input of the ears. When we're writing, the motor output of our hand, and speaking, the motor output of our mouth. It makes complete sense that the most effective type of language instruction would incorporate all those modalities simultaneously. That's where the magic happens, and that's the thing that has to be in place for you to see the results that you're hoping for. Now this comes from the International Dyslexia Association, 5 things that have to be there in the way that phonics should be taught. Again, the process that needs to be in place, not just that phonics is there. So again, the first one is explicit and sequential, which we are. There needs to be constant reinforcement so that they have that positive feedback and then that corrective feedback very, very quickly, so that they're not developing habits or connections that they'll have to unlearn later on, because that's far more difficult than to learn something new. To unlearn is really challenging. Something that moves, a program that moves quickly. If this program is used the way it's intended, then you will see those 2+ grade level gains by the time they complete it. Usually by the time they get to chapter 3, get into those phonetic skills, you can see a pretty significant jump, anywhere from 6 months to a year's gain. Getting into that 3rd chapter is really key. And that multisensory piece, which we have, and that it employs a marking system. That was something that has been shown to be important. What it does is it connects the phonology and the orthography of that word. For students and children like my son, who look at a word as an entire picture, as a whole, because he's accessing that right side, he doesn't automatically see the parts and pieces of the words. And if he can't see that, he certainly is not going to recognize it in another word, because there's so many of those pieces that overlap in other words that help expand our vocabulary when we can see the prefixes or the suffixes or base words or similar patterns. And if they don't recognize that, they're just really at a loss, because they can only memorize words as an entire picture. They can only have a certain capacity there. So one of the things that I love about this program, because I trained in several to look at Orton Gillingham programs to help my son, a lot of great ones out there for sure. The reason I'm here and not somewhere else is because of the simplicity and the power of what I see with Reading Horizons. We don't mark everything just for the sake of marking it. Nothing is unnecessary and everything is intentional. All of our markings either determine pronunciation or movement in syllabication. Let me say that again. All of our markings either determine pronunciation or movement in syllabication. They're all very intentional and nothing unnecessary, so that we help students see the parts and pieces and how that produces the pronunciation, and then leads to the ability to recall that word for use for receptive and productive vocabulary. So the framework, again, I mentioned how simple we are. There's a lot of programs out there that will, Orton Gillingham, 7 cutting patterns and 6 syllable types, and we amazingly address all of those, but in this very, very simple framework of taking them through the 42 sounds, these 5 phonetic skills that are 5 basic patterns for those English words and syllable types and those 2 decoding skills. So we are going to start with the simplest concept and go through those skills in chapter 1 today. Again, very intentionally. So the first thing that we do is we chunk the alphabet into bite-sized pieces for those working memory deficits. We teach it in sets, in letter sets, to work with and manipulate with just a small amount at a time to let them practice those initial skills of phoneme identification, manipulation, and blending for reading. Now again, intentionally, we go pretty much in alphabetical order. That's going to help with recall, but there's a few that are moved, again, very intentionally. We save C and K to the last letter set because they need to know all their vowels to spell correctly with it, and we'll talk about that more when we get there. We teach the process of our letter instruction is the same for every single letter. So let's talk about that process. There's three main things that we hit. For letter identification, there's a process, letter formation, and for blending. Okay, so letter identification. Initially, we teach the name and the sound of the letter simultaneously. We don't go through and teach the names of all the letters and then go back and try to attach the sound. That is really challenging for those that struggle. They need to have those together. That might take a little longer because they are working with a couple different things there initially, but they need to have that over and over again. Sometimes it's just a matter of repetition for those that find this a little bit challenging. I have found a lot of times with students that I work with that letter to sound mapping is the thing that takes the longest in their learning. And once that's set, once that's solid, once they're able to have that in a place that they can recall with automaticity, then everything else through the program will move. But there's been several that it's taken me months, depending on the level of their deficiencies, to be able to have that correctly. Particularly, you know, like a letter like M. When the sound of the letter is built into the name of the letter, like M, you can hear that sound in the name of it. That's easier for them to retain and to connect to and to map to. Something like W, when the sound is W, there's no connection there between the sound and the actual name of that letter. So there's some things that may have to be added depending on how much your child is struggling with that. A lot of things that I've done, you know, and worked with was, you know, creating a key picture with that letter and eventually those other phonemes and combinations as well. So you may do W wagon and do a picture next to it. I had one little boy who was very, very severe, who that still didn't work because there was just a disconnect in the space between that letter and picture. And so on the W, for example, I would write the W and I drew little wheels on the bottom points of the W and a little wagon handle coming off the front of that W, built it on that letter. And he was able to recall it that way because the image was built within that letter for recall. So it can be a big challenge, but it really is important that when you're introducing a letter, they say and repeat it so that they hear you say it, and then they write it simultaneously for that multisensory component. They say the name of this letter is A, the sound of the letter is A. That's really key. We do teach letter formation of uppercase and lowercase. Uppercase is easier because it tends to be more sticks. Where, you know, the lowercase has more of the curves, and that can be hard depending on fine motor issues. It is not a bad thing to make connections with letters that have similar patterns for the actual formation. There's several that are close in our sequence, and some you may need to go back and review in correlation with to help build upon how when you teach N, you know, when, like in our sequence, you teach N first and then R, and you can talk about how R is just like N, you just stop it before you get to that baseline. Making those connections will be really, really helpful for those that have issues with those formations, and pointing out to those key elements that it is lines and that curve, and just the length of those and the positioning of those is the only difference there. And then blending. So initially with that letter, we teach the name of the letter, the sound of the letter, uppercase formation, lowercase formation, and then we move into the concept of the slide. Let me, just a couple of things really quickly. We do have steps for the letter formation. One of the things that I wanted to talk about is remember that multi-step processes that are based upon sequence are very challenging for those with processing disorders. They will probably need to see a visual representation of that over and over and over again. Another thing to be cautious of is the verbiage that we use for spatial orientation for formation of those letters. You know, when we come up here on A and we say, okay, start at the top line and draw down. Well, if I'm vertically, like if I'm standing up at a whiteboard or my my desk is tilted, then spatially I am technically drawing down. But when I'm on a desk or a table and my surface is flat and linear and I'm drawing on my page, I don't draw down, not spatially. I drew towards myself. So be very aware of the verbiage that you use for spatial orientation. Say, start away from yourself at the top line. Again, top and bottom can get kind of tricky, but start at the line away from you and draw towards yourself in the direction you came from. Then come back up to your top line, draw in the direction that you're going to write. Draw towards yourself, come back up to your midline, and start on the left side and go right. Now, right and left can be an issue too, so you may need to do spatial anchors. Maybe you have a red star on the paper up here and a green star here, so start at the red star, draw towards the green star. Maybe even per line, you draw a flower down here and a sun up here, start at the sun in the sky and draw towards the ground. Different things like that can be very, very helpful. Having them say the steps can sometimes be helpful if they can hold that in their working memory and sequence. But again, you may need to do that for them and always have that visual representation. But just be aware of those things because I found that to be really helpful. My son has dysgraphia even more severely than he does dyslexia. So the handwriting and the spatial orienters are very, very challenging for him. And so I had to be very, very open to change with him because someone who struggles that way will also orient everything to themselves. And so they will always start closest to themselves and work away, even when they know the process is different. It's instinctual and it's safe for them. So we have to create ways that it's safe to work the other way and allow them some grace there that may be something, there are certain letters that my son still forms very differently than what you would do in a sequential instruction. And I just let it go. It was not a hill worth dying on, and it's something that for him, it was more trauma than it was important because it's still legible, you can read it, so pick your battles on that for sure. But a lot of times just changing the way we talk about the sequence of that formation and the spatial orienters can be really, really helpful in the difference between being able to do that letter correctly and not. So now moving into that slide, when we're moving into pronunciation for those purposes of blending, we don't say consonants in isolation. And when we do, it often changes and we add a schwa sound, and so then, instead of bag, we're saying but-ag, and there's a real hurdle to come over going from that initial consonant to that vowel sound. Again, students and children who have problems with language can have a sequence memory deficit, and one of the ways that you can tell that, well, several ways, the ability to recall a story in sequence from a comprehension standpoint, but down to the word level, they can isolate a word if they're still struggling so much. If they isolate it too far in time, like say the words cat and they sound it out like this, k, a, t, and then they go to blend it and they say tag. And they start with the most recent sound they produced and work back, and usually they miss the first sound, sometimes even the medial sound. That's telling you that they have a deficiency in their phonological sequential working memory. They're not able to hold those close enough in time in the correct sequence to go back and produce that word if it's not recognizable to them from their memory or they haven't pushed them together close enough. They need to chunk those initial sounds so that they can identify just two pieces rather than three. It's a huge help for that blending, and that's what we call recency effect. It eliminates that if used correctly. I've done a lot of times where I'll do slide drills just like I would do sight word drills, and I'd make a column of like 5 slides, initially with different consonants in the same vowel sound, then with the same consonant in different vowel sounds, and then completely just mixing that up. And that has been huge to help build fluency for those that have struggled with that initial blending. So that slide, we don't want them to say ba-ah, we want them to say ba and da. The slide arrow is the first marking that they work with. It indicates two things. One, it helps them visually differentiate that that is not a real word. That is just a slide. Because later on we're going to have words that follow that pattern, and there needs to be a way to differentiate between the two from a visual cue. that's what the slide does. That's why we don't mark the vowel with an X here, because later on we're going to do that in that pattern of a word, word ending in a vowel. So again, that slide arrow is really important, and we need to be intentional in that the arrow helps them know they're going to work left to right and that that's not a real word. Another thing that can be helpful on slides is to talk about the actual formation of those two sounds in the mouth, where they're going to start with that. Okay, for bat, I'm going to start with my lips together for that B sound and open them out to A, like I'm taking the bite of an apple. One of the things that has been so key, and recently this was just emphasized greatly at the International Dyslexia Conference I attended this past October, is students with working memory deficits, which is a large majority. Anybody that's got some sort of processing issue will have that as well. They need memory cues. They need something to help them recall. It's not that we're handicapping them, it's something that they need for quite a while, and anytime they learn anything new. So that's why keywords are helpful that have a visual cue, but they've shown that gestures are even more powerful than a picture. So when we're talking about the vowel A, for example, we suggest certain visual visual gestures for that verbal pronunciation of that vowel sound. So for A, for example, you would say, hold your right hand like you're holding an apple and pretend you're taking a bite of it, and you open your mouth really big. Ah. When I work with my son and with other students, I will show that every time I say that sound. And then eventually I can even take the sound out of it when they're working to recall that sound. I can just do the visual, that gesture, and that cue will recall for them that pronunciation, and a huge help to make that connection for them. So oftentimes I will show where my lips are going to start and then make that gesture for the vowel sound in these slides for those that are really struggling. The next part of the process, let me just jump back here really quick. So this last part will be go from a slide to building a real word and then to nonsense words. So after the introduction of the name and sound, letter formation, we go to the slide, and then we go to the real and nonsense word type of pattern. We talk about how a word has a beginning, middle, or ending sound. Once we teach in that first letter set those 4 consonants and that vowel sound and work with those in the slide, then we introduce this pattern. We drop the slide arrow because it's no longer a slide. It is the pattern of a word with an ending sound there. So then we drop that and very intentionally lay the foundation for automatic recognition of the vowels within a word and within a syllable. We do that by marking an X underneath that vowel, because later on we're going to prove that vowel sound within single syllable words and then within multi-syllable words, those syllables within those multi-syllable words. So again, dropping that slide arrow, putting that X under that vowel. Now, we have to make the connection for students that the slide is within this word. That slide bat is in the word bag. For most of us, that's an automatic thing. We don't even have to have that explained or pointed out. For those that struggle, they don't make the same connections automatically in most cases. So the mantra that I have, that I just preach over and over again to teachers, is assume nothing, connect everything. Assume nothing, connect everything. That's going to help in so many instances. I don't assume that my child is going to see that slide within the word bag. So I cover the G with my hand and I say, what's my slide? Ba. Roll on my ending sound. G. What's my word? Bag. And then immediately you want to use this word in a context sentence. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. But it is so vital in understanding the word to connect that meaning to it. We are not just a phonetic program, we are a reading program, and that vocabulary is vital. We are hitting hard the phonetic and orthographic representation of that word, but we also hit the meaning of that word. So often when I go back and observe teachers, the thing that they leave off is when they're dictating and working with the students, whether it's one-on-one or small group, if you're working with more than one child at a time, they don't use the word in a context sentence, and that is vital to help make that meaning connection, and for semantics and syntax, know how to use that. Also, to talk about nonsense words really quickly. We indicate that it's a nonsense word, again with a visual differentiator of that asterisk in front of that, so they know this is not a real word. They don't have to try to attach meaning to it this time. They can just look at this word from a pure phonetic and orthographic standpoint. Now, It's really important that we use nonsense words, particularly for our older children that we're working with, because so often when we're working with these initial skills, if they need this type of instruction in Chapter 1, they may have memorized these words. They've been seen enough in books that you've read to them that they're able to spit that out. And we can get this false sense of where they're actually at in the reading process because they're able to have a high enough visual memory. A lot of them do to compensate a great visual memory. And so they can snow us. My son was really good at that for a long time. And I thought he was reading, but he wasn't. He was spitting back out words from a memorization standpoint. And so it was really important when I used nonsense words that for me, all of a sudden I really saw where those deficiencies were, and I'm able to then adjust my instruction and my work with him so that he can get the additional practice that he needs for success. So again, we use nonsense words all throughout the program so that we can reinforce that concept. So let's talk about word storage, and we're talking about building our children's vocabulary, why this is so important, even this phonetic standpoint. There's 3 elements of word form storage. There's the phonological, the sound, the orthographic, or the symbol that represents that, and then there's the morphological word form storage that's roots and affixes, parts of speech, things like that. The meanings of words are actually stored in different places in the brain. You know, if it's a concrete noun, a lot of times that's stored in a visual center. And if the word is a verb and it's an action word that requires motor skill, a lot of times the meaning of that word is stored in the part of the brain that deals with the motor skills. So we really have to search for it a lot of times, and those connections are made all over the place, and those are reinforced the more we use them and the more often that happens. So those 3 elements are part of word form storage. I remember going to a class when there was about 200 of us in there, and the teacher said, or the instructor, the presenter, she said, you know, tell me what you're doing for, you know, vocabulary instruction. So we all came up with these great things. You know, we do vocabulary cards, we act out the word, we have to use it in a sentence, you know, all of those things. And she said, you know, that's great for teaching the meaning of the word. What are you doing to teach the phonology and orthography of the word? We're all just kind of dumbfounded for a minute because it had never occurred that those 3 need to happen back to back simultaneously for true word form storage. And that's the beauty of what we do, is that if you focus on the phonology and the orthography, the pattern, and the meaning at the same time, you have a really powerful word form storage. So how do we do that? So these are strengthened through what we call the phonological loop and the orthographic loop. And I talked about this in a vocabulary presentation, but I just want to mention this because the most important process that we have in this program and instruction is the dictation process. And I want to explain why that's so important. Students with dyslexia and dysgraphia at times will have a deficit in the phonological loop. Someone with dysgraphia will have a deficit in the orthographic loop. Someone with oral and written language learning deficit, or we call it ALLD, will have a deficit in both. Their loops are what you think. Start a place and come back to it. These loops start from a sensory input, go to a motor output, come back to a sensory input. The only way to fix deficits in these loops is to use them over and over again, back to back. To build the phonetic connection, we take a code from the sensory input of our eyes, what we see. We say it. We say what we see, and then we process that auditorily. We hear it. The orthographic loops picks up where that phonological loop leaves off. We hear a word. Then we use the motor output of writing that down, or the sound, or whatever we're working on, and then we visually process what we wrote. There is usually a deficit in one or both of these if your child is struggling with reading and writing. The only way to fix these is to use them in this sequence over and over and over again. And that's what the process of dictation does. I had the video of the process of dictation, but we're not going to be able to get sound to it. So Josh mentioned that he would just send you all a link post this webinar so that you can view that at your own leisure to be able to talk a little bit more about that process of dictation. So the process of dictation, I'm actually going to skip ahead and then come back to that one. The loops, what is so powerful about our process in this program is that the process of dictation employs those loops simultaneously. So when you work with either in that first letter set, he may be saying just a sound or a letter, uppercase B, and then you have your child repeat it, uppercase B, and then you want them to write it. And we usually do that on the whiteboards initially for a couple of things, a couple of reasons. Using large motor skills actually employs a different part of the brain. It uses the frontal hemisphere, which is involved in working memory and can help in those deficiencies there. On the whiteboard, it's less intimidating because they can erase. It's not so permanent as when they're writing it on a page, and that can be helpful. And then again, some struggle with the fine motor, and so the large motor is a really big break for them to be able to use that. So they get to hear and say the word. We start with the auditory, the oral instruction. Then they write it. They go to that motor output right after the motor output of saying it. And then they mark and work with the word, that kinesthetic experience, to visually process what they're seeing, what they wrote, and then they read that word. There is nothing more important you do than this process of dictation. It can be anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes depending on your child's attention span that day, but it usually do so well with that because it's so interactive. They can do it for quite a while because it's involving all the senses and all the motor output. That is really key. I remember working with my son and feeling kind of silly doing that one-on-one, but it is so, so, so important. I know I was working with a student one-on-one. He was a 5th grade student, and we would work on his spelling words. Well, he would work on them at home, and his mom, he would fail a spelling test every Friday, and his mom came to me just absolutely in tears asking for, how can we help him? Can you please pull him out? Can you please pull him out and do spelling in that pull-out time, in his tier time? And I said that I would talk to his teacher and his coordinator and see if that was okay. So we got that cleared. Teacher was great to work with. I dropped his list down to 10 words. 20 was way too many. Someone who struggles like that, working memory issues, 10 is about the max that they can do. And I did the spelling test based on a phonetic concept, rather than, just grade level words or words that were in their book. We did specific phonetic skills, when we were working on blends and all of our words contained a blend. Or if you were working on letter set 1, then, your spelling words would come from that. So I did that with him. Well, he got about half right. And, I was excited that he got some right, but he was such a bright boy, and he knew immediately the connection he made was that he still failed. It was still an F because he only got half right. So, we did that for a couple of weeks, and I was just up the night before, really just sick to my stomach, not wanting to give him the test again because I knew it didn't seem to matter what we did. He just could not retain those well enough for that test. And it occurred to me, before I understood the process of the loops and how important that is, that when I did dictation with him, he was fine. So I thought, well, why don't I give him the spelling test that way? In this process, I say it twice, he says it twice, writes it and marks it. So I went the next day and asked him if it was okay if we did the spelling test that way, and he said, yeah, that was fine. Did the spelling test that way. He missed one. It was the first time he passed, and he'd gotten an A, and he was ecstatic. And now I understand why that happens. And I say this all the time to teachers. If you're doing spelling or vocabulary words, regardless of the subject area, use this process of dictation and you will be amazed at the results that happen because of it. Because of what's happening in the brain when you're doing this, because of those loops that are being employed simultaneously, that multisensory piece, all of that. When you teach a vocabulary word, process of dictation. You say it twice, they say it twice, they write it, and then use the Reading Horizons marking system. If all they know is to mark their vowel phonics at this point, fine, do that. Eventually they'll have the skills to get to the whole word. But it is so, so powerful to do that. What happens when our goal is that comprehension goal, is to remember that these foundational pieces are so, so, so important for truly understanding words and moving to comprehension, because when that phonics, phonemic awareness become automatic, then we get true fluency, not just because they've seen a passage enough times, but true fluent reading that will then be able to let them read more, because vocabulary they've shown comes far more from just a passive type of our experience with vocabulary as opposed to actual intentional vocabulary instruction. And so if our children aren't reading, they're not increasing their vocabulary. And so we want that process to be something that they enjoy so that when they are, when they have some time and they want to read, then they're more in tune with what they're doing and can increase their vocabulary just from that experience. And then their comprehension is going to improve as well. So in this chapter 1, after that letter set, so the process is exactly the same. One of the things that is important to note is this. So we start with vowel A in that first letter set with the visual cue, that gesture of holding the apple in our hand and opening our mouth big for A, pairing it with those consonants, upper and lower case, practicing that formation, but then moving to a slide and real word and nonsense word. When you're talking about the second letter set, there's something important that we do. You only want to teach one concept at a time. So when you bring in a new concept, you want to put it in a familiar framework or process paired with previously taught information. Not, so for example, I wouldn't teach vowel E and consonant H and put those together for the first time. What I want to do is take a vowel that they already have worked with and pair it with that new consonant in a slide to produce that pronunciation. We want to pair anything new with something that they're familiar with and have shown proficiency in. Then, when we teach the new vowel, the way we practice it first is also with those consonants that they're solid in. Again, let me point out why that slide arrow is so important, because they may say, you know, that's the word B. And you're right, that is the word B. However, what does that arrow indicate? That it's a slide, which means we're going to use the vowel sound eh. And so this slide would be be. Remember that proficiency drives pacing, not a calendar. You don't have to do everything within the lesson. If they're getting it after you practice these a couple times, move on. Move on. Stay with your child's pacing. If they show proficiency, not necessarily perfection, but proficiency, move on. If they need more, provide more practice. Sometimes you can move on a little bit and come back and reinforce it later, because you don't want it to stagnate. You don't want it to stay on one concept because they make a few errors until you feel like they get it perfect every time, because that's going to be as discouraging as anything for them. So keep a consistent pace. Show proficiency. Keep reviewing and coming back if necessary, but also move forward. But they're able to go quicker if we aren't bringing in more than one concept at a time, keeping that very, very simple. The vowel sound E, the difference between E and I, which we intentionally separate E and I in our vowel instruction. We don't do traditional vowel order of A, E, I, O, U. We go A, E, O, U, I, again, very intentionally, because E and I are the hardest to differentiate auditorially and the slightest change in production of that sound within the mouth. So you don't want to pair things that are similar and yet slightly different too close in time, because that just creates more confusion, particularly for those that struggle. We want to separate those. They can become proficient in vowel E before and then practice some other sounds. Give them some time before they bring in vowel I. One of the things that I'll do with vowel E is I'll draw a really big E on my paper, and then I put two little eyes right here and a little nose, and then I draw a tongue down here and that little neck of, or that little hook of that E, and I'll show how my mouth, my chin is dropped way down. That's the biggest difference there, is to show that that chin is way down, where in I sound I, the mouth is more tightly closed, and so I really overemphasize the dropping of that vowel eh. So a lot of times I'll put my finger on my chin and pull my chin down to show that. A lot of times I'll just kind of use my first finger to indicate the shape of my chin, that it's like a smile and it's down low. Or you can put your hand behind your ear and say eh, like a cute little grandma or grandpa that can't hear, and you say eh. Again, I cannot emphasize enough how valuable these gestures are for vowel sounds, because vowel sounds are usually the most problematic. If they've got a consonant sound they're struggling with, create a gesture, and they're more likely to be able to recall and use that. So again, process is the same in that new letter set. Name of the letter, sound of the letter, uppercase formation, lowercase formation, moving to a slide, using it in real words, using those in context sentence to connect meaning and nonsense words. After the first letter set now in the new program, we introduce what we call most common words, or sight words. this is really, really important because they have to know those with automatic recognition to be able to read and produce sentences. And a lot of those don't play fair phonetically, which is why they're handled a little bit differently. We do want to look at what does work within those. Talk about the phonetic elements of it, but also how it's used. Used and automatic recognition, so repeated exposure is really key with most common words. The little boy that I had, he was such a blessing to get to tutor because he had so many deficits and challenges that I had not encountered that I had to come up with a lot of different things that really stretched me in my teaching and in my tutoring, and so grateful for that sweet little boy who they thought would never read and did. He's the one I drew the little wheels on the W for, and he just needed very, very specific things. One of the things, so I call him, his name is Chad, and so I call these Chad's vocabulary cards. He's the one that came up with these 4 sight words because he could not remember sight words because he could not attach a visual. You know, I can remember house because you can visualize house, but how do you visualize and? Well, he taught me there is actually a way that you can draw a picture for every sight word, and you do it by using in a sentence. So if your child can write all of these down, great. If not, all they need to do is write the word in a word web on a card. I use big cards. He even wanted just big pieces of paper initially because his fine motor skills were so deficient initially. So on one side of the card, or on, I would fold the paper in half and put that on the front of the paper, and then on the inside he would do the word web. I would just do the word on the one side of the card on the front of the paper. I would underline that word because in our program most common words are underlined. We don't try to prove them with a marking system. You can come back and do that later on if they have sufficient skills, and if that works for them, that can be really helpful. But they just look at that as a unit. This is the one time they do look at the word as a whole. So we underline it, and then I say, I use the word and in a sentence, and you want to try to put as many concrete nouns as possible around those sight words, those most common words that you're working with. So I did the sentence, the simple sentence, I like milk and cookies. And then he came up with 2 sentences. You want to give him 3 options. So he came up with a couple sentences. Sometimes you may have to do 2 sentences and they can do 1. If you're working with one or more than one child, then you can have them each come up with 1. Like the dog and cat ran home, or I like peanut butter and jelly. So I write all those down and underline that most common word and then I say, from these sentences, what does and mean? It's far more effective and actually easier for us cognitively to produce the meaning of a word from use rather than to look at the definition and then come up using it in a sentence. That's more problematic. So we want to go the other direction. So we use those in a simple sentence and then we come up with what it means. Some of the things might be, you know, 2, more than 1. In addition, there's a connection between them. Plus, whatever that is, you can put it down. And then I say and have the child now pick a sentence, pick one of the 3 sentences, and I want you to draw it. Draw that sentence. So, you know, you were able to draw milk and cookies. Of course, that's just an actual picture, but, you know, if you draw it on, regardless of what it looks like, that will make a connection for them to recall visually. When we did the word the, he did the dog ran, and he needed it simple. I think he said the dog ran home. And he had a bunch of dogs on that he drew, and he took an arrow and pointed to one dog, the dog, very specific. And when we did the vowel A, and he did a dog ran home, and he did a whole bunch of dogs running, and he put a big question mark above them, like a dog, which dog? Sometimes his connections were very, very crazy, and they didn't make sense to me, but they made sense to him. And his pictures are what helped him make a connection and remember those sight words. So that can be something that is not specifically talked about in our program. That's something that I've had to just kind of augment with the more severe that I've worked with, but seen some great, great, great results with that. Now we have great vocabulary strategies that can be brought in and have used as great resources. And this word web, of course, is one of them, but I just kind of expanded that for these most common words, and this can be really helpful if your children are struggling with that. So just to quickly, I'm not going to go through each letter set extensively, but just to look at how we instruct it. The process is always the same. Uppercase, lowercase, name, sound, slide, real word, nonsense word. Again, I just want to point to that order of our vowel instruction and talk about really quickly those gestures for each vowel sound. For O, sound ah. Again, remember we're only doing the short sounds of these vowels, even if they may know the long sounds. If we're working on blending initially, just to make sure they're clear on that, I'm just wanting to work one concept at a time, and I don't want them to have to differentiate their attention. So just the short sound of the vowel. So O sound is ah. We actually make the shape O with our mouth, and so you can actually draw attention to that by using your pointer finger and showing that O that you just drew, drawing a circle around your mouth. A lot of times I'll use that finger like a tongue depressor and push it down so that I'm showing that, like when you go to the doctor and they say ah, you are pushing your tongue down, so I can use that as a symbol. On U sound the gesture would be, you know, have you ever been hit in the stomach with a soccer ball and you put your hand on your stomach and you go, so that's my visual cue, that's my gesture to put my hand on my stomach when I say the sound And I, you can use a couple different things. I usually draw attention away from my mouth to help differentiate even further from E's short sound and I will just scratch my hand for the sound I for itch. Or I can, you know, put my finger on my nose and go icky. That's another one. Those are suggestions. Those are all suggestions in our manuals. You don't have to use those ones. You can make up your own as something that works for your child, but giving them a visual gesture is so, so helpful to recall those vowel sounds. And I use it when I'm even dictating the words to give them a cue of what vowel sound is in there. And sometimes I even have to use it later on when we get into chapter 3 when they go back to that, proving that short vowel sound and differentiating between that short and long sound. Sometimes that can be really, really helpful as they move into that. Again, the last thing that we teach in Chapter 1, along with those most common words and some of our reference or grammar lessons to help, because we want them to be able to use these words and in sentences, be able to recognize them as receptive, but also produce those. And so that's really key that we have that in there. But the last specific spelling skill that we teach will be the CK skill. And, you know, I try to make it as fun as possible and say, you know, I've got a candy bar. If you can tell me why we spell cat with C and kitten with K, or why do you think that is? Try to let them discover that on their own. Look at these words. What do you notice about these words? And then I may give them another hint. Look at the vowels that follow that sound, because the sound C makes it and K makes it. How do I know which one to use? Look at the vowels that follow it. Which ones are being used with which letter, C or K. And so then we can have them help discover, oh, there's certain vowels that go with that. And then they can learn and use the mnemonic device. K will take I and E, and C will take the other three, or C take A, O, and U, and K will take the other two. So again, just to go back, our foundation is very intentional. We are having them, we're working on those initial skills of phoneme identification, mapping, production, recognition of, and then going from blending those into slides and into real words and identifying those vowel sounds in there so that later on when we get to the phonetic skills, they're automatic at recognizing those vowels within words so that then they can prove those sounds within words and then within syllables. So it's just important to remember that there are very intentional reasons why we do what we do. We do start very simple. Will all your children need to start that simple depending on what age they are when you start this program? Not always. But again, never assume anything. Go with them, make sure that, teach them. So if all you wanted to do was move, if they know their letters and sounds, you're pretty sure they do, there are just 3 concepts from this chapter that you need to teach. The concept of a slide, so they understand what that slide row is because they'll use that with blends, marking their vowel with an X, and the CK skill. Those will usually be 3 things that will be, you know, new to them. And so those 3 things need to be taught. Again, the concept of a slide, marking the vowel, probably what a nonsense word is too if they haven't worked with that, and then the CK skill and how that works. Then you can move them into Chapter 2, which is what we're going to talk about next time, and how to reinforce those processes that are laid here very intentionally. And then we can move through very quickly because when the processes are familiar and consistent to them, they feel safe. And they're able to focus on the new information that's coming in and learn that very quickly, be able to work with it and store it, making connections with all those other things that they've worked with. So those working memory deficiencies are handled and they're able to make the progress that we're hoping for. So those are some of the core things that I wanted to talk about in that process today with that initial Chapter 1. So let me see if, trying to see if there's any questions that need.
Yeah, okay. At this time, anybody that wants to
ask
any questions, please speak up. There is one there for you.
Somebody
Chantel.
asked if these, okay, yeah, someone asked if, which book is this in? They're in the instruction manuals. These ideas are all in, you know, the instructor notes and in the modeling of that new concept. So if you've gotten a kit that have the instructional manuals that are scripted to help you with that process, then that's where you can find those. Any other questions? I don't know that we have any other questions. And you, I should have put my email at the end of this. You're always welcome to email me or to Josh, and he can forward it on to me. But my email, if another question comes up, is my first name, Chantel, Shantell, at readinghorizons.com. Let me see. I just had another question come in. My 9-year-old still struggles with BD reversals, both writing and reading. Any suggestions? Yes. To kind of, it helps to kind of understand what's happening with that. It is not, we use the term reversal because they are a mirror image of each other, but that's actually usually not what's happening. So, for example, if you look at something in your room right now in front of you that's three-dimensional, like a picture frame or a pen or something, regardless of where you turn it or where you set it in the room, or if you turn it upside down or flip it around, conceptually, it is still a picture. It is still a pen because of the way that we see that from that perspective. Well, students and children who access that right side function very much the same way with these two-dimensional letters that we place in front of them. That B and D, depending on which one they're imprinting that day, it's the same to them. They apply that same principle. So they can turn that letter around any direction, and to them, it's still a B, regardless of whether it's flipped in the direction of a D or whatever. So again, it's spatial awareness and spatial orientation to themselves. So you may have seen where they'll use, like, you make them with your fingers, or you do like the bed. The important thing is, remember this, they have to orient it in a sequence they're familiar with and to themselves spatially. So what I'll do is I have those that I work with make their hands in two fists, and then they point their first fingers up. And then I take a marker. You can use, whiteboard marker or permanent marker if you want it to last, and I draw on that first finger and around those knuckles to see the B and D. Then I write the letter A, and then I write the letter C, left to right, leaving a space. And sometimes you can write A, B, C, D if you need all 4 letters. And you have them put on themselves, or put their hands on those letters, or in between that A and C, and then after that C, that oriented to themselves on their body. That stick coming before the ball is their B. Moving left to right sequentially on their body, that doorknob before the door is their D, but also it's connected on their body. They can visually see it drawn on, and it's in the sequence of the alphabet. Making those simple connections, you've probably done something similar, but those couple little things, I learned this from a man who works in this field and is just a genius in it. Those couple little things added will make all the difference in the world. Then every time he runs across that, have him use his hands and orient it on himself, which that is, a B or a D. Have him place it on top of it. It may be something he struggles with, to be honest, forever. It just depends on the way he's visually processing that day, what he's anchoring on. Helping him have ways to differentiate that are oriented to himself and within sequence are your best help. But I've seen a lot of success with that. Where do you get the package with the materials? That is something that you can talk to Josh about. Online, you can order it at our home use, or Josh would know more about that, and he could work with you if you email Josh directly. And his email is josh at readinghorizons.com.
And the website is actually www.readinghorizons@home.com, and that at is spelled out AT. So. And I'll get that information out to everybody that attends this webinar as well.
Good questions, you guys. Any other questions we can answer? Let's see, we just had another one. Oh, I'm glad. Someone just shared that they're grateful for this and being able to have strategies to be able to successfully teach their child. Without question, I know how overwhelming that was as a mom working with my son. And when I realized the deficiencies, I became even more overwhelmed and it seemed like there were so many options out there, and everybody says they work, and a lot do, without question. But I promise you from one mother to another that this works, and that it is simple enough for you to do and to do well with all of those resources, and that it really does take a long time the more they struggle, and to just don't ever give up. You just keep working and trust your instincts. Mom instincts are better than anything out there, and you know what to do best for your child. So we are here to help. Please don't hesitate to email and ask. I tend to travel a lot, so sometimes I'm a little slow, but I promise I will get back to you, and it never bothers me for you to just keep bugging me. That helps me actually remember sometimes my working memory struggles, but I think that's more early onset of Alzheimer's than anything. But don't hesitate to ask and reach out, and we do want to be a support out there, because as much as we want to help the masses, this is one child and one person at a time, and it's life-changing for them, for sure. So we're there to support you. So our time is up. Josh, if you just want to close things out, thank you again for attending. I look forward to visiting with you all next month.
Great. Chantel, do you have just a second? I have a question that I get asked quite often, actually, and that's usually along the lines of there's so many different levels that a student can be entering this program in, and being able to quickly, if they're in chapter 3, or if they're in working on decoding and are pretty close to that area, how do I quickly get them there, or how do I understand where they're at phonetically?
That's an excellent question, and I get this asked all the time too in schools. This is a very common question. One of the things you've got to remember, which is why I take so much time at the first to talk about why this process is so important, you cannot just jump a child in. Even if they are at multisyllable words, it won't make sense to them. What makes the connections and rewires the brain in these proficient manners is the sequence. So like I said, if they know their letters and sounds, you take 15 minutes teaching the concept of a slide, marking their vowel, and teaching the CK skill. That's your lesson that day. Then the next day, you would move into chapter, you never jump them any further than chapter 2. So in chapter 2, now again, if they're working with single syllable words, you just have to explain, I want to teach you how to handle these really big words, but there's some skills that you need to learn first. I know these words are going to be simple for you. It has nothing to do with your intelligence. You have to be clear to your child about that, because when we start with basic words and they are needing to read multisyllable words, they make the wrong connection and think it means they're dumb, and that's not the truth. And too often as parents, we think they intuitively understand that. They don't. Look them in the eye and say, these skills have to be taught in a sequence to make your brain rewire. Does not mean you're dumb. Means there's some connections off there that I have to do in a sequence. If you understand this and you get it, we're going to fly through this super fast. You could conceivably get through chapter 2 in 3 days with your child. You don't have to do every activity. You need to stay core to the process. With blends, which we'll talk about next time, the process is the same as it is with letters. You teach the blend, you model that concept. Again, it's arced because it's a unit in our program. Anything that's a unit, meaning it creates a sound or moves together, is arced. They need to know those blends with automaticity so that by the time they get to syllabication, they don't have to focus on, oh my gosh, is that a blend? Because that affects where they divide. Because anything that's a unit doesn't split. They have to have automatic recognition there. That's why that foundation is so important. So you can conceivably go through all 6 L blends in one day. Practice them in the same process with a slide for pronunciation, then in a real word, then in nonsense words, and use dictation so that they're making those connections correctly in that process of dictation. Then the next day, review a couple of those and then move into the R blends, then do the S blends, picking up what grammar lessons you feel necessary. But if you want to speed through the phonetic end, you could go through that faster and get them into multisyllable words, but you have to stay in sequence. Okay, because that's really, really important. Again, you can just spend 15, 20 minutes on a concept. You can maybe do a couple lessons in a day. So it's just based upon their proficiency. I have a student that is stuck at the point of fluency. He can decode excellently but does not read fluently. What is the disconnect there? There's a lot of different things that can go on there. Usually they're still not understanding. It's moving into the understanding conceptually what the word means and how it works. And sometimes you have to break down, as you know, the sentence process and how that works. Again, think of chunking, just doing phrases like a noun phrase like the dog, and then pull it out and go to that whole sentence level. Sometimes you just have to piecemeal that as well. Fluency is just a time thing and exposure. Go back to the slide within the word. Sometimes that's helpful. Again, more than anything, it's just a time thing and repeated exposure. So that just comes with more and more practice and recognition of those. It's not uncommon, but there's not really any particular tricks other than breaking it down, chunking it, kind of the same things we talked about, chunking it where you can, making visuals, and then just practice on that end for them. So hopefully that answered that.
Great.
There's just truly, they can decode, and again, it's a lot of times putting it on a page. If they're struggling fluently on a page, cover up the page and do it like a sentence at a time, or like I said, even a phrase at a time, because a lot of times they're inputting, when they go from single word to sentence and page reading, they go back to the same compensation strategies and they access that visual side that looks whole apart. They look at the sentence as an entire picture, the page as an entire whole. And so again, that process of not only handling a word, but handling a sentence and handling a page very systematically is something for a lot of children. We have to be explicit about how a sentence works, what it does, and practice just fluently reading sentences or phrases, and then sentences, and then a paragraph. Sometimes you just have to break down the process. Too often we jump from a word because we think they've got the word, but then they can go to reading a whole page, and there's steps missed in there. So just catch up your steps, be explicit as you possibly can, moving from word to page level, and again, just time.
Great. Thank you, Chantel. Looks like there's no more questions, so we'll end this webinar, and please join us next month for part 2 of this training webinar for our Orton-Gillingham methodology. Thanks, guys. Have a good one.